Hey there, comic book fans. Got another thing for you to look at tonight. And this is the Steranko History of Comics, Volume 1. With a really nice Jim Steranko wraparound cover. Look at that. Let's see if we can't open it up. And I first read, this is going to be the first time I'm looking through it in years and years. I actually read this back when I was around 10 or 12 in the late 70s when my local library had a copy of it. And for me, this was like discovering some ancient volume of, special mystical history and lore. Because this is all about the Golden Age comics. So you can imagine, being a kid in the late 70s reading about comics that happened in the 40s was a long, long time ago. And I got this copy of it in the early 90s. I think it's got a copyright date of 1970 in it. Yeah, copyright 1970, Jim Steranko. So, like I said, I read it in the late 70s, dedicated to Jack Kirby. And I picked up this copy in the early 90s. And it was weird because it was the boom times in the early 90s when everybody was opening a comic shop. So somebody I knew, an acquaintance, opened a comic shop. They happened to live in, in the suburbs out here, in a house that happened to be zoned commercial. So he opened up a comic shop in like his bottom floor and back porch. And he got these in one day. And I was like, wow, I haven't seen those since I haven't seen it, because I never ran into a copy of this. And I always saw them selling for a few bucks whenever I saw them, advertised wherever. But I hadn't seen it since I was a kid. And I was like, well, how much are that? I thought it was a reprint or something. But there must have been a warehouse find. He couldn't even find on his order form where this was. So he gave it to me for cover price. So I got this in like 1991 for the 1970 price of $4. I got volume 2 also at the same time, but we'll just look at volume 1 now. Steranko was a graphics guy, so of course you get a nice graphic logo there. With a foreword on the influence of comics by Federico Fellini, the filmmaker. Steranko, History of Comics. Wow, I haven't looked through this in a while. Was that an Alex Raymond drawing? There's the Federico Fellini opening, and here's a little preview for Steranko. And this is mostly text. There was a lot. I remember as a kid, I reading a lot of text and going, wow, there's a lot of words in this. Even though I read books, so it wasn't that big a stretch. But still, being 10 or 12 and reading all this text was different for me in a book about comics. So here we got some Hal Foster. That must be what's his name, Prince Valiant there. The Phantom, Dick Tracy, Red Rider. Looks like Terry and the Pirates over there. Wow, Noel Sickles. That's the Noel Sickles Terry and the Pirates. So did he do it before? He did it before Kniff, didn't he? Oh, anyway. So he goes first in history. It looks like he's going through, since comic strips were around before comic books. This is the first look I ever got. More Alex Raymond. What Alex Raymond is this? Is this Buck Rogers? No, that's Tarzan over there. Must be a mix, different. Let's see, what does it say down there? King Features, copyright 1970. Buck Rogers, yes, must be Buck Rogers. So it goes through all the early comic strip stuff. This is 84 pages, by the way, just in case you were wondering. But that's a big page filled with type. So it goes through. This is all early comic strip stuff. Steve Canyon. There's some Milton Caniff. Is this all Milton Caniff? Yeah, this is all Milton Caniff here. So it goes to the Steve, and this is probably the first time I ever heard of all this stuff. Ever heard of the old comic strips? Ever heard of Milton Caniff and Alex Raymond and all that? Because these are all comic strips from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, which I knew nothing about. Bern Hogarth's Tarzan. It's probably the first Bern Hogarth's Tarzan I ever saw. Slam Bradley. Okay, so we go to the comic strips, and now he says, The source was the pulps. I just noticed that here because I know the next section is the bloody pulps. This is, once again, this was the first time I had ever heard of pulp magazines. It looks like we have some white on black reverse type. And this is also nicely designed too, because Steranko was a designer. Look at that nice, the shadow. So he goes through the history of the Shadow magazine, all sorts, and mentions all sorts. I don't have to reread this someday, being that I haven't reread it since the late 70s. Even though I've had this copy for what 20, I don't know, 27 years now, really should reread it. But yeah, the whole history of the Shadow. Look at that, Superman, Doc Savage, man, that little Doc Savage, man. This was the first time I'd heard of all of these. It was like a thrill to be a kid and reading all this. The name Superman was around before the character Superman. That's just what he's showing you here, because the name Superman comes from the English translation of Nietzsche, the German philosopher who actually, it's funny, I read Nietzsche, probably around the time I bought this in the early 90s, and they actually changed the name of Superman in the Nietzsche translations to Overman, because Superman had become so associated with the superhero that the people who were translating Nietzsche didn't want you thinking of the superhero Superman when you read Nietzsche. So they like I said, they retranslated it as the Overman, which they had some reason for using Overman. He's above us. So look at this, the spider, and I can remember reading in like Origins of Marvel Comics, Stan Lee talking about his origin of Spider-Man and him liking the spider, and it's the first time I ever got to see Spider. Matter of fact, I'm not sure if I read this before or after Origins of Marvel Comics. I may have read this before. So I knew what Stan Lee was talking about when I read that in Origin of Marvel Comics. So there's some Spider pulps. The Phantom Detective, Black Book, just went through these really popular pulp magazines that had all sorts of stories in them, and garish artwork for the covers. The Black Bat. So this is another, besides the comic strips, here's another source that comic books came from, is these pulp stories. These fun pulp stories, G8 battle aces, and there was just here's a lot. This is more history of the pulp stuff than I've probably read since. So there's lots of information going on here. Weird Tales, where H.P. Lovecraft was printed, Double Detective. But as you can see, there's not a whole lot to look at here, but there's a ton to read. Of course, there are all these little black and white illustrations on the top of each column. They're black and white reproductions of full color covers, so they weren't that exciting. But this is all telling the origin of comic books. It's like, wow. We get into the adventure and sci-fi ones, Wonder Stories, Planet Stories, Future. So this was like really thrilling. Oh, there's a full Amazing Stories, 25 cents. See, who is this? A cover of magazine which featured the original Buck Rogers story. So there you go. Buck Rogers started in a pulp magazine. I had no idea. I'm just familiar with the comic strip. Startling Stories, Captain Future, Planet Stories. The comics industry was officially about to be born. So that we end the pulps and we go into, of course, the superstar, Superman. There's this, I've seen this reproduced a lot of times, but never this big. Good stuff. We go 4 pages from an unpublished Superman story. This is the first time I knew that, Superman was around before Action Comics #1. So they tell the origin of Superman here, some Siegel and Schuster. There's look at this. This is the comic strip that was originally the Superman thing. What does it say here? A sampling of Superman's opening newspaper sequence. So this is where I learned that Superman was they originally had it as a newspaper strip. Wow, who knew that before I read this? There's some Superman covers, some Golden Age Superman, which I was completely unfamiliar with. There is, what is this here? A pound by breakdowns of early Superman stories. So it's like, I never saw this is the first time I'm seeing anything about breakdowns and drawings. And there's a whole lot, there's a lot of Superman stuff. There's a lot of Superman information in this book, as you can see. Look at all those great Superman covers. Now, of course, then we go into the Playboy hero, Batman. Tons of information. What's this? Unpublished Bob Kane drawing of them, inked by Robinson. Vintage 1939. There's an old one. You know what? I don't remember if this tells us how much this tells us about Bill Finger, but I think it probably does. I'm sure Jim Steranko. I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure Jim Steranko wasn't buying the these story of Batman being solely created by Bob Kane. But wow, look at all this stuff. Brothers Robinson appear. Yeah, lots of Jerry Robinson in here. Robinson's DC artist Bernie Klein installed drawing boards. Flap became a hangout for comics men. Frequently half a dozen artists like Charles Biro, Bob Wood, Mort Meskin, and Whit Ellsworth would congregate to finish a few pages and discuss storytelling techniques. That's just a little thing that caught my eye right there, and I'm probably loved that as a kid, reading that. There's a Joker. This is Jerry Robinson. Right, Robinson's sketch of Wayne and Grayson done on a notebook paper during class. It's a little bit about Jerry Robinson creating stuff. Wow. I wonder if it mentions George Roussos in here. George Roussos was an inker, and he did a lot of the backgrounds in the early Batman stuff. I happened to work with him at Marvel in the 90s, so it's amazing that I knew someone who was... there's some Bill Finger still reigned as Batman's scribe preeminent, even though he was frequently late with his stories. He worked hard, often sweating out a script until the very last minute, sometimes writing complete scripts overnight. So there's lots on here in Bill Finger, even if the general public didn't know about him too much. Steranko sure did. Oh, there's George Roussos. Robinson began working over Kane's layouts, eventually turning out his own stories. George Roussos did background, lettering, and inks. Fred Ray pitched in for a few covers. So look at that. George Roussos does get mentioned in this. George Roussos, when I was working at Marvel in the 90s, he was still working in the comics industry at Marvel as a cover colorist. And colorist on staff. Now we get into Captain America after some Batman, some Simon and Kirby stuff. Like I said, I was reading Captain America as a kid, but I didn't know anything about his Golden Age Captain America. I mean, what a different thing this was. Look at these covers. I think this was the first I'd heard of. Or was the comics? Oh God, I can't remember his name now. Oh well, the guy who did so many famous Alex Schomburg, who did so many covers for Marvel, and there's some great. Who I didn't realize was born in Puerto Rico. You don't think of a name of like Alex Schomburg as Puerto Rican, but that's where he's from. Captain America. Look at all this stuff. I wonder if there's some Schomburg cover. I don't know if he did some early ones. I think this is all Simon and Kirby that I'm looking at here, but I'm not sure. Once again, origins of Captain America stuff. There's some Jack Kirby from '67. Captain America's Weird Tales. That's when the 50s Cap came around. Let's see what else we got in here. We were growing up. Cap died late in 1949, officially signaling the twilight of the hero. Sic transit gloria mundi. No one noticed, no one mourned. We were growing up. Then we're back to the beginning of the Golden Age with the Human Torch and Submariner. And I can remember I read some of Bill Everett's drawing. They reprinted some of Bill Everett's earliest Submariners in The Invaders. I remember reading those and being fascinated. But here was the whole story of the Human Torch and the Submariner and their fire and water battles. Great stuff, great stuff. Marvel Mystery Comics. Kazar. I remember reading Kazar. I don't know if I had read any Kazar 70s stuff before I read about him here. What else? Look at all these great. Schomburg did a bunch of these Marvel Comics covers, I believe. I think Schomburg's mentioned in here somewhere. I believe see, Timely's most curious and interesting title was Red Raven Comics, dated August 19. Imagine, you know, it's so funny thinking about back when I first read this. It seemed like all these comics were made in like a completely different time, because when you're 12 years old reading about 30 years ago, it seems like forever ago. But you know, when you're 50 years old reading about 30 years ago, it seems like yesterday. Blonde Phantom, All Winners, all this Timely stuff. So I never heard of this stuff. It was great going through it. Best supporting characters. Here we go into the JSA stuff. I hadn't read any JSA stuff at all. There's that famous World's Finest cover. Flash Comics, Adventure Comics. Like this was all the DC stuff that I had never, you know, because I was a Marvel kid, I never knew anything about the 40s DC stuff, of course, even though some of it was reprinted in the 70s. And those 100-page specials, I never got them, so it was great reading all this Adventure Comics. The Spectre, I remember him. Who's this? Beautiful, Jerry Robinson and Mort Meskin. Wow, I did a video on Mort Meskin last year, the year before. I'll leave a link to that, because I wasn't that familiar with him until I read a book on him a couple of years ago. It was real interesting reading about Mort Meskin. He was one of the biggies of the Golden Age, who by the 70s was gone, so I didn't know him at all. All-Star Comics, Leading Comics. Look at all. I mean, this is just chock full of information. They are the real. What is that? It was these men: Siegel, Schuster, Finger, Kane, Weisinger, Gaines, Kubert, Burnley, Fox, Infantino, Schwartz, Meskin, Ellsworth, Toth, Mayer, Kirby, Robinson, Moldoff, Boring, Peter, and their associates who deserve the credit. They are the real authors of the history of comics. Oh yeah. Oh, the Kid Gang stuff. Wow. Simon and Kirby invented another genre, the Kid Gang genre. Once again, just who knew about the Kid? I knew nothing about the Kid Gang genre in the 70s. Beautiful. Boy Explorers. Oh, the original Daredevil. I didn't even know there was an original Daredevil when I was 12. I was like, holy cow. Who knew that? And then we end with some Steranko pages. Wow. I remember looking at this and just loving it. A little Jim Steranko bio. And that's the end of Volume 1. So there you go. Like I said, I devoured this as a kid. It was my introduction to the Golden Age of comics. And I think I remember reading Volume 2, but I remember less about it. It's on my shelf, so I'll have to pull it down and look at it another time. Because the Volume 1 was the one that really got, like I said, I was 10 or 12, the most impressionable age, and I was a fan of history, so reading something about the history of comics was great. So hope you enjoyed that look at Steranko's History of Comics, and you all have a good time out there.